Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to the first Majlis of this year, and I'm very happy to announce you what you all know already, which is that our guest today to open the year is Master Hugh Kennedy. So that's a great joy to have him here, and I don't think anyone would need an introduction of Hugh Kennedy, but in the format of this Majlis, some of you are new to it, so I tell that we organize these Majlises in a way that the first part of the meeting is like this after talk dinner discussion where we discuss our trajectories, our life, and our goals, and so it is always to our guest to introduce themselves in a way they wish to do that, and so we will start with that, and then we will follow on with you continuing on his friend al-Balādhurī, and then we will get to the discussion. And the discussion, before we start the discussion, I will stop recording, and so you will be free to ask whatever you want to ask without having that forever on our YouTube channel. So that's the plan for today. And yes, as a scholar, Hugh doesn't need introduction at all. And I thought I would say something about him as a person, which is very relevant to our Majlises. I think it's actually one of the inspirations of this Majlis. So I met Hugh, I don't know whether the first time or second time in my life, at one of those conferences I went to during my research fellowships. One of them, I don't know which one, with this virtual tattoo on my forehead, saying, I'm a little calf. I'm coming to this market. Please buy my brain. It's fresh. I'm coming to sell my brain. So yes, that wasn't very pleasant. And what was really unpleasant is when I met Hugh, and I was full of admiration of him and affection, and then as a great scholar, and this strange feeling that how on earth can he distinguish between my sincere admiration and love for everything what he has done for the field and for us who study the field, and the flattery which we have to apply and our heroes in the past had to always apply in order to find some support in our career. And actually, interestingly, Hugh immediately gave me immense support, simply by I tried to explain this. I don't know what I said, what the little calf said, but his reply was so clear that we know that, don't worry about it. We all know that. We were in it. We haven't forgotten this. So that just be yourself and be free, and we won't blame you, and we won't misunderstand your gestures. And it was really liberating. So a belated thank you for this, but a public thank you, Hugh. Thank you very much indeed. And now I will silence myself and let wisdom speak.
Thank you so much, Esteban, for that very glowing introduction, and thank you for organizing all this and so on. I'm very I think this whole Majlis idea is a very good one. It's a wonderful one to have on a sort of Friday afternoon, evening, when we're, I'm sorry, Monday afternoon, evening, what am I talking about? But when we're perhaps a little bit relaxed and we can, push some ideas around and so on. So Esteban has asked me to say a little bit about myself. I never have any difficulty talking about myself. There's lots to say. But I would just make one or two points, and people say to me frequently, how is it that you became interested in the history of the Middle East and so on? And the answer is particularly one of those serendipitous things, almost. I was always interested in history, and I was brought up in Kent in southeast England, which is full of castles and churches and everything like that, all medieval things. And my parents, who are both GPs, they weren't academics at all, took me around to these things, and that excited my interest. But when I was at school, I had a friend whose father worked for the United Nations in Damascus. And this was 1964, so it's a little time ago now. And his parents said, why don't you bring a friend out to Damascus for the summer holidays? And so on. So I said, yes. And so we went out to Damascus. In those days, you didn't fly to Damascus or anything like that. It was far too expensive. We went out by train and by boats and so on and so forth until we reached Beirut. And I spent 3 or 4 weeks there, I guess. And sometimes he and his parents had to go to other places, and he was a sort of diplomat like the United Nations and so on. So they went off and so on. So quite a lot of time I was actually on my own in Damascus. And Damascus in those days was almost unrecognizable from the present. It was the old city surrounded by the Futuḥ, and in those days the Futuḥ was full of wonderful fruit trees and dusty little roads and isolated villages, and there were trees between and orchards and gardens between the walls of Damascus and Sophia up on the mountains. There was a rather elegant French period colonial quarter, which we lived in, or I stayed in. And I fell completely in love with it. I thought this is the most wonderful thing. And because I was interested in history, I started looking around for histories of this city and civilization and so on. And I found there really wasn't very much, and particularly very much that was accessible in English, or French for that matter. And perhaps it was then that I decided that this is what I wanted to do. And I was 16 then. And I was incredibly lucky, looking back on it, that I knew from the age of 16 what I wanted to do, which was to write the history of this area in all its glory and all its intrigue and all its messiness and so on and so forth. And I went to become an undergraduate at Cambridge and read Arabic and Persian for 2 years, Arabic and Persian in a way that nowadays seems immensely, perhaps old-fashioned, very concentrating on grammar and the great historical texts. And particularly, I remember reading with the late Peter Avery, the Gulistan of Sa'di, and he encouraged us to try and write Persian poetry in the manner of the Gulistan of Sa'di, and so on and so forth. It was really rather a wonderful but completely bizarre sort of education. Arthur Arbery taught me. I was Arthur Arbery's last pupil, and he was a funny old stick. And he used to give the same lectures year after year after year on the al-Akhbar, and there was there was no real English translation. There was a Samizdat translation that went down and TypeScript translation that students passed around and so on. There were only about 7 or 8 students in the class, but he was unfortunately an extremely boring lecture. And because I was in the same college as he was, I went along to the lectures, and by all the other people stayed away. So I would go along, I would be Arthur Arbery, and it'd just be Arbery and me in this small Cambridge room with a hissing gas fire and so on. And he would lecture as if he was lecturing to 100 people. I mean, he hadn't paid any attention to me at all. But one day he said, towards the end of the course, when I'd for a long time been the only pupil, he said, "Where have all the others gone?" Sad sort of way. And I couldn't bear the time that it was all, well, firstly, of course, it's so boring. And secondly, that they all had a translation which would see them through the exams anyway without coming. So it was a funny old-fashioned thing. And then in my third year, it's a 3-year degree, I changed almost completely. And I went to read history and medieval history. Didn't do anything that wasn't medieval. And there were 2 very good things about it. One of which was that the late Martin Hines and Muhammad Abdul Hayy Shaban taught a course on Islamic history. And this was when both Heinz and Shaban were producing their ideas, Heinz on the political alignments of Kufa, and Shaban on all the things that Shaban talked about. But it was, as you can imagine, with those two, if you've ever come across any of them, extremely lively and vigorous debate, very different from Arthur Arbery's classes and so on. But the second thing, and that was, I was filling up my dance card, so to speak, of different courses to do, and I chose a course on the reign of King Stephen in England, which was nothing to do with the Middle East at all. This is a 12th century king of England, and it was actually a very interesting educational experience because it taught me. We had to read in those days the chronicles of the reign of King Stephen, which are interesting and lively, but we also had to read the charters, the acts of King Stephen in what was called the Regesta, Regi Stephani, and we had to read them in Latin too, because it was in those days that you did that sort of thing. And it taught me. It was run by a man who everyone's completely forgotten, called Vivian Fisher. I think he was one of those old-fashioned Cambridge academics who never really wrote anything at all. But he was a great teacher. And we went through the documents of the reign of King Stephen. He explained how to read them, what you could get out of them, what the importance of witness lists and things like that was. In fact, the whole science of what medieval historians call diplomatic, i.e. just how documents work, why they're constructed, how they're constructed. And looking back on it, I think it was one of the most interesting and formative educational experiences that I've had, because it really taught you meticulously to look at sources and read them very carefully and so on. And so then I went on to do a PhD on the early Abbasid history in Cambridge. Without any supervisor at all, actually, because Martin Heinz went and lived in Egypt then and so on. So I really did it on my own. And what I was trying to do was to look at a prosopography of the early Islamic elite. I was very influenced by historians like Ronald Syme on the Roman Revolution, or even going back to the 1930s to Louis Namier on 18th century Britain, and feeling that if you work out the prosopography of power, then you're going to understand the political history. And without that, you really can't. As Ronald Syme said, all political systems, when you look at them, are an oligarchy. And no matter how absolute the ruler appears to be, you can't understand their behavior and what they're doing unless you understand the oligarchs, or as we might say, the constituencies that support them. And I set out to analyze the constituencies which supported the early Abbasid Caliphate, why they did it, who was there, what their objectives were, and so on and so forth. And that formed the basis of my first book on the early Abbasid Caliphate, and lots of my work that's been done ever since. I still have in the corner of my office here the old filing cabinets, the old paper filing sheets that I had, where each person's name was written on, where I found them, and so on and so forth. A technology of research, which I think has completely vanished from the face of the earth now. But there it was, that's what he did. And then miraculously, I got a job in the University of St Andrews. And I got the job in the University of St Andrews in the medieval history department, where most people did the history or medieval history of England and France and the papacy. That's the fundamental, ultimately Oxford-based system of what medieval history looked like. But I carved a niche for myself. I was given a niche actually, to teach the history of the Caliphate, of early Islam, but of course always in English, always to non-Arabists. And so it was fun to do, and I made a lot of rough and ready translations of Arabic texts and so on. But I also taught a load of other stuff, because there's a limited demand for these things. So I taught courses on the city of Rome. I taught courses on Hohenstaufen, Germany. I taught for a long time a course on Christian and Muslim Spain in the Middle Ages, which became a book in a sense. I wrote a book a long time ago now. It's on Muslim Spain and Portugal a political history of Al-Andalus, which I believe is still in print. People still use it and quote it. And that brought together, so to speak, my Western European understanding, because I use Latin chronicles as well as Arabic ones, and so on. So I did all that sort of thing. And because we were looking for courses that were popular to students, try and persuade them that medieval studies were interesting and exciting and so on, I taught a course on Crusader castles. In fact, it was much broader than that. It was castles in East and West. And that led to my Cambridge book on Crusader castles, which I think is sort of still the basic introductory thing. I was asked to do a new edition of it quite recently, and I turned it down because I really wanted to go back to Syria, and I really wanted to rephotograph some of the monuments, and I wanted to do much more about Muslim military architecture and so on. But of course, I left it too late, and Syria was impossible. So I've never gone back to that book. And frankly and sadly, I've given up hope that I will ever be able to do that. And given my engagement with Damascus since 1964, this is a particularly sort of grievous blow. So I was at St Andrews, and I loved it. It's a very good department, a well-run university. Imagine saying that, a well-run university, if I ever heard of it. Anyway, I then decided at the age of 60 that it was time for a change of outlook or a change of venue. So I applied for the Professorship of Arabic at SOAS, which I got. And this was really quite a radical change of intellectual environment, because it was not just moving to London to a metropolitan institution as opposed to the windy seaside town in northeast Scotland, but also it meant that I had to teach Arabic, which of course I'd never really done before. And this is when I got and said, what can I do? What is going to work for me as a teacher of Arabic? And I still continue to teach a lot of introduction to Middle Eastern history and so on and so on in SOAS. But I also developed slowly a course on reading classical Arabic historians. And that's been one of the great joys of my later career, because I've started off not really knowing what I was going to do with this stuff or how I was going to interest students in it. But over the years, I've got to understand it more. And students actually seem to love it. I mean, a sufficient number come every year. I teach a class of 15 or so on, and they have to know enough classical Arabic to read the sources in Arabic. And those who can love it, because there's so much richness and so much intriguing detail. There is so much you get out from reading slowly and carefully quite small bits of original text that you never get out of any translation. The whole structure of sentences and the whole use of vocabulary, specialist vocabulary and so on. And I got very, very interested in this, and I still am very interested in it. And this leads me on to the next bit of what I'm going to say and so on. And that is my work on Balādhurī's Futuḥ al-Buldan, which is, alhamdulillah, actually been, I want to hold it up. Probably, I don't know whether it comes out the right way around or not even, but it is now actually being published. And it combines Balādhurī's Futuḥ, and the work I've been doing on Futuḥ combines all sorts of parts of my career come together in this way. Anyway, and I use the phrase "an old friend," and it's that's how I feel about it. Ahmad ibn Yaḥya and I have been friends since I was a first year undergraduate, which was in 1966. And I came to Balādhurī because Balādhurī's Futuḥ, because it was the only then primary historical source of any importance that was available in English translation. The whole history of the publication of this book is interesting. the history of publications of Arabic texts is always interesting. It's one of the things I say to my students. Let's look at this as a rounded artifact. It's not just one man writing something ages ago. It's much more complicated, much more interesting than that. For reasons I'll explain a little later on, I think Balādhurī's Futuḥ can be dated to 865, 866 of the Common Era. Though he died, he's said to have died in 892. The book is clearly finished in its present form earlier than that. And it always was in circulation, but there are very few manuscripts. There are actually 3 significant historical manuscripts of this text. 2 from the 11th and 12th century, including the Leiden edition, the Leiden manuscript, which the standard edition is made on, but also a Yale manuscript in the Barnica collection in Yale, which I'm convinced is a mid-10th century because of it's ascribed in the incipit, in the first bit of it. It's ascribed to a man called al-Farghani, and it says Bikhatihi in his handwriting, also, I think. Bikhatihi, and Farghani is a known figure of the 950s, 960s. He wrote a now lost continuation of the history of Tabari and so on and so forth. So that's a much older manuscript, but it's very similar to the later ones. But we know that it was quite widely because lots of people quote it. People like, particularly Yaqut, writing his great geographical work in the 1220s, had clearly had a copy of Balādhurī's Futuḥ in front of him, and he quotes it very extensively. So it was quite well known. And then it becomes edited, or it was from the Leiden University collection, Leiden University manuscript. A lot of manuscripts came to Leiden University in the 17th and 18th century from Dutch traders and collectors and diplomats in the Middle East. And one of these was the manuscript of Futuḥ. And it was edited then by Miguel de Huya, if I got the pronunciation right, Goeje. Miguel de Huya was a man of fantastic energy and a very good Arabist. This was the first book that he edited in 1866. And so, it was published in 1866 by Brill, of course. And it established itself very early on. Balādhurī's Futuḥ was edited really 20, 30 years before Tabari's Tarikh al-Rusul wal-Muluk, which was also edited by the Yaḥya. It was edited almost the same time as C.J. Thornburg edited the Kamil fi Tarikh of Ibn al-Athir. And it was just the period when the scientific edition, that is comparing different manuscripts and trying to work out which is the proper readings and so on, the scientific reading of these manuscripts was developing. And Balādhurī's Futuḥ, therefore, as it were, was first in the field and became widely used by Arabisants and people who were using Arabic texts and so on from that on. But partly because compared with Tabari's Tarikh or Ibn al-Athir and so on, it was quite a manageable size. I mean, the translation is about 550 pages long, but it's not long like Tabari's Tarikh is long. It was translated into English, and this is where I came across it. It was translated to English by Philip Hitti, a well-known Lebanese Christian scholar who worked in Princeton for a long time, and a much less well-known man did the second half, was Francis McGotton. Anyway, so it's published in 2 halves in the 1920s. In fact, the first one was like before that. But this again was important in understanding the trajectory of this this work, because it was, as I was saying, it was the first major work of early or classic Islamic historiography to be translated into English. And so everybody who was not conversant with Arabic, and lots of people who were or hoped to be conversant with Arabic, would go to Balādhurī's Futuḥ to find out the earliest records of the Islamic conquest. So it's a book that has a long history and so on, but curiously hadn't been studied very much until Ryan Lynch's book with Bloomsbury 2 or 3 years ago on al-Balādhurī and the Futuḥ. It's a book about the book, so to speak, and it's very interesting, very good piece of work, I think, and I'm very grateful to it because it, as it were, cleared a lot of the ground. It meant when I come to do the translation, I didn't have to do explaining who all the sources are in great detail and so on, and explaining the context because Ryan had done a lot of that. And so my translation is, in a sense, a supplement to Ryan's work, and the two, in a sense, should be together. So let's move on to the Futuḥ. The Futuḥ al-Buldan was written, I think, in the year 865 or 866. Why do I think that? Given that he lasted, or he's said to have died in 892, it seems a bit weird, but there are two things that make me think that. The first is the number of early witnesses, and I talk witnesses in the sense of evidence of the text. Clearly, early in the 10th century, it was quite well known, and we know it was written. Qudama ibn Ja'far in his al-Kharaj quotes it and so on. So it was around and about in Baghdad intellectual circles at a very early stage in the 9th century. But secondly, because Balādhurī often carries his narratives up to a certain point and makes him, he doesn't just talk about Futuḥ and conquests, which I'll come back to, but he leads the story on to a certain point, and he updates it, as it were. But these updatings stop in the 866, I think, is the last one. And it seems to me inconceivable if he carried on working after that, that he'd have gone beyond, that he wouldn't have carried in extra detail. Now, this is very interesting because there's a lot of debate about authorship and so on of classical Arabic texts. And a lot of the conversation that's happening nowadays is essentially about is such a real thing as a text and so on. We're going on from Gregor Schurler's model of the interactive text, as it were, interaction between verbal communication and the written text and so on and so forth. And people, fall to saying things like, we can't really be certain about authorship. Maybe there's no such thing as authorship. Maybe everything, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think, and I've argued, and I still believe this, that Balādhurī's Futuḥ may be just an exception to this. I think it is a single author book written by one man at a certain time. And if I'm right, and I'm sure that lots of people will disagree with this, but if I'm right, then it's very interesting because Balādhurī was a nadim, which is a funny word, sometimes translated in English as boon companion, which is a funny sort of pseudo-medieval word. But I would prefer the word to describe him as a cultural counselor, basically, a cultural advisor. Anyway, he was a nadim, and he worked at the caliph at the court of the Caliph al-Mu'tawakkil, who was assassinated in 861. He worked, in fact, at the last time at which an Abbasid caliph could reasonably claim to be ruler of most of the Muslim world. It's true that Al-Andalus and the Maghreb and Sicily had largely sort of drifted away, but he ruled over an empire, if you like, that stretched certainly from the western borders of Egypt to Samarkand and Sind in the east. So he's at the last stage of the last generation that could live in the great caliphate. And I believe that his writing and his vocabulary particularly, but also the way he presents things, basically give us an insight into the writing culture, historical culture of the last period of Abbasid rule. And I think that so many things changed in the 10th century. The caliphate continues, of course, in various ways, but so much contained changes in the next century. But I think it reflects administrative practice and administrative vocabulary in the period, as I said, before the breakup of the Abbasid Caliphate. And if I'm right, then it's very valuable, and it's important to study the language really quite carefully, because it gives us an insight into official Arabic. Al-Balādhurī was a Nadim, and he worked very intimately with the highest echelons of the court of al-Mutawakkil. There's a story in Yaqut, which I produced in the, which I give you in the introduction to this volume, about Yaqut, about Balādhurī, sorry, Yaqut's Irshad al-Arib, that is. The Yaqut describing an anecdote about Balādhurī in the court of al-Mutawakkil. It's a small group meeting, basically, with the caliph and his chief political advisors and so on. And there's Balādhurī, you think, sort of probably sitting in the corner somewhere, because he wasn't particularly rich or famous or anything. And one of the courtiers comes in and produces this letter, which he wants everyone to admire and the caliph to sign and so on, about changing the date of the collection of Kharaj and in the Sawad, and also the relationship between Christian and Muslim calendars. And when he's finished reading this out, everyone sort of claps and applauds him and so on, says, what a wonderful letter, except for Balādhurī, who, as it were, sticks up his hand in the corner and says, there's a mistake in it. And everyone says, oh, no, shock horror. How can there be a mistake in this? This is a wonderful piece of prose and so on. And then he goes into quite an explanation of how the dating between the Christian and the Muslim days is wrong, because the Christian days start with the morning, go through to the evening. The Muslim days start in the evening and go through the next day. So you get one day wrong. And of course, he's absolutely right. But I think it reveals the very competitive cultural atmosphere at the court of the time. But also Balādhurī is an old pedant, if you like. He likes to get the facts right, and he's very good at it. But it also reflects on time-founded characters. A lot of his character, or a lot of the book is, I'll come back to this, it's sort of, look how clever I am. I can do all this. I know all these things. And this little anecdote, this little vignette that comes in Yaqut, I think, sort of positions him very, very well, sort of competitive cultural environment. And when we come back right at the end to looking at why was this book written, I think that's an important thing to bear in mind. And so the plan of the work is unique. It doesn't follow no Arabic history either before or after was written along this plan. It's just like his much bigger work, which I don't want to get into, partly because I've never read it, or I've only read a tiny bits of it, the Ansab al-Shraf. It's a plan all of its own. And the plan is basically it's a book of the Futuḥ, if you like, the conquests. And there we have to think what Futuḥ means. Obviously, it's Fataha, to open, and so on and so forth. We all know these things. But it's often translated as conquests, which is one of its meanings. But it's much more than that. Fred Donner has written a very interesting essay on the meaning of Futuḥ and so on. And it also means opening up a sort of mise en valeur of the different the landscapes, how the Muslims established them, and so on and so forth, established themselves. Philip Hitti, followed by McGotten, produced a translation of The Origins of the Islamic State. And that's actually a really good translation, except it bears no relation to the Arabic at all, as there's nothing about it. It is in the Arabic, it's Kitab al-Futuḥ, or Kitab Futuḥ al-Buldan, So I steered away from that for a bit, and I did entirely, and I've called it the Arab conquest or something, a fairly conventional thing. So it all starts off, the conquests begin when Prophet Muhammad, coming from Mecca, rides into Medina and establishes himself and starts to build his mosque and so on. And it takes, the first section of the book takes the story from that. And he talks about the conquest of Arabia, going right down to Yemen and Oman and so on, though he doesn't know much about either Yemen or Oman, but anyway, he puts it around it. And much more about the conquest of Khaybar and Farak and the places between north of Medina and so on, because these are very important for establishing what Prophet Muhammad was doing and the decisions that he made. Then it goes on to conquest of Syria, and then from Syria he goes on to the conquest of the Syrian armies in Egypt, into the Maghreb, and here's a chapter on al-Andalus, which contains almost no information about al-Andalus whatsoever, but is largely about the succession of governors in Ifriqiya in North Africa. But nonetheless, he calls it. And then he, as it were, goes right back to the beginning again. And the conquest of Syria involves also the conquest of the western bits of the Taurus Mountains and so on, as far as Armenia. And then he goes right back to the beginning again, talks about the conquest of Iraq and the foundations, the tamsir of the two garrison cities at Kufa and Basra, and then the conquest of the Kufan armies in northern Iran and Azerbaijan and so on. And then back to Iraq again, he shows us the activities of the armies of Basra, which of course reach Khorasan, but also finally ends up with the conquest of Sind. And then there are 4 chapters on the origins of Muslim coinage and the origins of the whole Diwan system and so on and so forth, which form, as it were, appendices to what he's writing. So it's a comprehensive account of the conquest of the Futuḥ. And you might think, therefore, that you get one thing after another. There'll be a sort of template. Okay, here we go in Syria, and there's a template. This is what you discuss in Syria, and so on. Then you go to Jazeera, and this is what you discuss in the Jazeera. Each chapter would follow some sort of a system, but it isn't really like that at all. Though it's the division of the geography is very systematic. What he talks about in each chapter is very different, and it's different in 2 particular ways. The first is that it's different in the sources that he uses. Now, al-Balādhurī was probably writing mostly in Samarra or Baghdad. Al-Mutawakkil lived in Samarra, so he must have lived in Samarra as well, because the text. But he traveled to certain areas and he didn't travel to certain other areas. And his sources really divide into 2 groups overall. And one are the groups that the material that he gets from written sources. And these are introduced usually by the word qala, because of course Arabic uses qala, but he said in a source in the way that English, this book says, and so on. You don't do speech necessarily. There are various other ones, dhukira and various other ways of doing this, all of which appear to be attached to written work, some which still survive, and we can trace where al-Balādhurī is getting material from. Then there's another group of sources, which are what I call hadathani sources, because they are, I'm convinced, sources that he got from the spoken word. And there are 2 reasons for thinking that, or one main reason, and that is that all the hadathani sources are people he could have met in his lifetime. Take the material that comes from al-Waqidi. Al-Waqidi died when al-Balādhurī must have just arrived in Baghdad when he was a very young man or whatever. Oh, there is no Hadathani material from al-Waqidi, abadan, nothing at all. But when he comes to Muhammad ibn Sa'd, who he describes as al-Waqidi's katib, al-Waqidi's secretary, then he uses Hadathani. And Muhammad ibn Sa'd was certainly a writer who was around when al-Balādhurī, quite a young man, he died, he's an older generation, but was definitely there. So I think it's, and there's some, this is something that Ryan Lynch talks about as well, but I'm convinced that if we see Hadathani, that this is an indication that he got it from the spoken word. And the stuff that he gets from spoken word is very interesting because some of it's about, as it were, general events in the metropolis and so on. But a lot of it comes from certain areas. It's clear that he picked up verbal information in the areas of the Jazeera, Syria. He uses quite a lot of Damascus sources and information as well, and Syrian sources, a little bit from Egypt, even curiously, a section from the Maghreb, from the Maghribi, who must have come to Samarra and so on, which I believe is the oldest actual living, the oldest direct witness to the history of the Maghreb, because most of the historians of the history of the Maghreb are much later than this. And he gets them, of course, from Basra and Kufa. But he gets no Hadathani material from, say, Khorasan, which plays such a huge part in the early Islamic conquest. He gets, curiously, quite a lot of Hadathani material from Armenia, but none from Azerbaijan. So I think we can actually, and I haven't done this systematically, we can see how he traveled to various places that had, as it were, local schools of history. Antakya, for example, produces a number of historians, all of whose works are lost. So the material is very different in that way, but it's also different in the things that he's interested in. And some of it is, as I say, look how clever I am sort of stuff. The account of the conquest, in inverted commas, of Medina, when Prophet Muhammad arrives, is largely concerned with a verse in Quran about the mosque that was founded in error. And he quotes all sorts of authorities and parallels to show that the mosque that was founded in error, and what is the mosque that was founded in righteousness, and so on. This is the mosque of the Prophet. And it's a classic piece of tafsir, but it's the only time he goes into tafsir in the entire work. It's almost as if he's saying, look, I can do tafsir. Okay, I've done it. Move on to something else. There are other areas where he does genealogy and lists of early Muslims. And one of the more strange things about it is when he's talking about the early phases of the conquest, he says nothing about the Battle of Badr. He says nothing about the Khandaq. The Battle of Uhud is only mentioned once, and that's because there's an irrigation channel which particularly interests him, which flows by the monument to the martyrs of Uhud. Otherwise, the great battles of Prophet Muhammad, nothing. And there's no lists of the Badriyun and all this sort of stuff. But when it comes to Yamama, where there's a hard-fought Muslim conquest, there he gives a full and comprehensive list of the famous Muslims who were killed in Yamama, and the famous members of the Ansar who were killed in Yamama as well. It's almost, again, as if he's looking not to go down the conventional route, but to choose rather out-of-the-way examples of material to use. And you might think that a thing that was called a Futuḥ, conquests and so on, would be full of battles and details of battles and so on. And quite a lot of battles and some details and so on in it. But military historians trying to look at the question of why were the Arab Muslim armies so successful can get almost nothing. There's none of that discussion of tactics that you get in Caesar's Gallic Wars or even some parts of Tabari, in fact. There's the stories about battles are fairly formulaic. You know, the horses are slithering on the blood of the slain, and so on and so forth. But you strongly get the impression Balādhurī had no more witnessed a battle than most people listening here witnessed a battle. He doesn't seem to have any sense of how battles could evolve or anything like that. So from the point of view of military history, it's almost completely useless. But he talks about battles, to be sure, but that's all about who were the famous Muslims who were slain there, who did fantastically brave things, and above all, the poetry that was what was composed about these battles. So you get all that stuff. But in terms of even great battles like Yarmouk and Qadisiyah, there's almost nothing we can learn about military strategy or anything. Now, and here's another thing that it doesn't talk about, or it talks about in different and funny ways. There is in the standard accounts of early Islamic historiography, like Chase Robinson's really very useful book and so on, bigger book. There is this thing going through. This is really what Robinson calls Heilsgeschichte, but is this a history of holy war? It's to show how God championed the Muslims and they defeated all their enemies and so on. But if we're trying to, as it were, put this model into Balādhurī's Futuḥ, it's actually rather puzzling, because he certainly talks about the battles and how the Muslims did this, and he says Allah gave them victory and so on, and, you know, okay, well and good. But a lot of his material is not about this at all. It's the conquests are done. Okay, that's done and finished. But it's the aftermath of the conquests that he is particularly, or he selects stories from, and not all of them reflect very well on the Muslims. In the conquest of Khorasan, for example, where he has no local sources, but we know he had access to Abul Hasan al-Madaini, whose work was well known by this stage, and whose work was incorporated in huge detail by Tabari and Tabari's Tariq al-Sulman. His conquest, his account of the conquest of Khorasan, says almost nothing about the conquest of Khorasan. It says we don't hear anything really about the conquest of Samarkand or Bukhara, or the great campaigns that took the Muslim troops right to the frontiers of Central Asia and beyond the frontiers of Central Asia. What we do have is two narratives. The first is the rebellion of the sort of robber brigand Musa ibn Khazim, who takes the town of Termiz and allies with the Turks, basically, to defend himself against his fellow Muslims. And he comes out as a sort of, and his seerah, if you like, the seerah of Musa ibn Khazim, takes up a lot of the space. And the other thing is the death of Qutayba al-Muslim, when he tries to rally the troops of Khorasan, both Persian and non-Persian, and Persian and Arab, to support his rejection of the caliph, of the new caliph. And there again, that is recounted in enormous detail, or very vivid detail, not enormous detail, very vivid detail. So his priorities in the conquest of Khorasan are not really to do with conquest at all. There's nothing about the Abbasid revolution. There's nothing about the campaign against the Chinese army that led to the Battle of Talas in 751. There's nothing there at all. And this is curious. He's more interested in divisions amongst the Muslims and their rivalries, and the personalities, in fact, of Qutayba, Ibn Muslim, and the Musa ibn Khazim. And there are very, very critical passages in the conquest of Khuzestan, which is southwest Iran. But he talks about the conquest of Khuzestan. It's very interesting, actually, because the Khuzestani chronicle that tells almost exactly the same story, but that's interesting for another reason. And at the end of it, there's an amazing piece of hijab poetry. And the hijab poetry is an anonymous That's what people sometimes call satire or whatever. But anyway, abuse poetry, basically, about the wickedness, the venality, the greed of the Muslim conquerors. Not written from a point of view, is written from a point of view of a Muslim. I mean, the writer is clearly an Arab Muslim, but criticizing the leadership remorselessly. They were all, they were all on the make. They were all dishonest. They were all doing dreadful things, and so on and so forth. Which, if you're going to write a book about explaining how glorious the Arab conquest is, it's a funny sort of thing to put in. Put it that way. It makes you really think, what is this book really about? And we go on about it. There are just, because the time is hastening on, there are 1 or 2 little points that I mentioned. Talked a bit about sort of. And Balādhurī's use of poetry. Balādhurī's use of poetry. There's another thing that the people are writing about the Islamic historiography say that the poetry is essential to the message. The poetry is fundamental to our understanding what goes on. I don't think Balādhurī uses poetry like this at all. The poetry is mostly tangential to the narrative. So in the Battle of Qadisiyah, there are people boasting about how they'd come all the way from Yemen and they were fighting bravely and all that sort of stuff. But a lot of the poetry, like the hijab that I've just been talking about before, really don't advance the narrative or tell us very much at all. But some of it is very curious and interesting. Some of it I think is extremely ancient. In a chapter on, there is a chapter on the wells of Mecca. This has got nothing to do with Futuḥ, but it's after the conquest of Mecca. And it's very interesting because it's a purely antiquarian interest. I mean, it's all about wells of Mecca. And it contains a number of very short poems, some of them, though not all of them, written by women, about the excellence of their wells, and that other people's wells were disgusting and full of noisome water and so on, and so on and so on. I'm convinced that these poems are very ancient. I'm convinced that they come from a pre or very early Islamic milieu, but they're nothing to do with Futuḥ at all. They don't advance the discussion of the Muslim conquest in any way at all. Balādhurī chose them because they were curious, and possibly he was the only person around who knew them, and things like that. I think his use of poetry again is unusual, idiosyncratic, very much a part of this man's view of the world. Another thing that might is the attitude to the Umayyads. Now, it's a real cliche that I've read so many times in discussions of history and historiography, that Abbasid sources were hostile to the Umayyads and so on. Well, some of them may be, though less than you think. Some of them may be, but Balādhurī isn't, not in the Futuḥ, possibly in the South, but he isn't hostile to the Umayyads. In fact, the Umayyads have rather a starring role in the conquest of Syria and so on, particularly, but also as administrators and so on. Now, it's true that Abbasid caliphs and the Rashidun caliphs all have little eulogies, may God be pleased with him, may God have mercy on his soul, and so on. The Umayyads never get that. That's true. But he really gives prominence to the role of Yazid ibn Abi, or the role of Abu Sufyan, the great opponent of the Prophet, and of his 2 sons, Yazid, who died in the plague very early. But of course, Muawiyah gets a terrific press as a defender of the Muslims against the Byzantines and so on. And later historians Umayyads like Hisham and so on certainly come in for are given big roles, and there's no sense of criticism of that. So it is a funny and, in a way, contrary book. And it's not at all what you think it's going to be about if you just read the title and expect to plow on through. But Balādhurī is, just as a final point that you may be relieved to know that I'm going to make, is that Balādhurī is quite a shrewd historical critic, in the sense of trying to decide what, in his view, is the word he uses is thabat. And the word he uses, thabat, means reliable information as far as he's concerned, and what isn't. And it's a very interesting discussion in the discussion of the conquest of Damascus and what date this occurred on, and so on. And rather than just saying it was one thing or the other, he says that this is the problem, that the Muslims conquered Damascus, they entered Damascus, and they made an agreement with the Muslims that was written out, but was not dated. And then they went off to fight the Byzantines at the Battle of Yarmouk. And nobody knew whether they're going to win or lose, or whether they're going to come back, or whether they'd all be killed, or whatever. But then the Muslims come back, and the document, the peace document, is reissued with a date. Now, why al-Balādhurī is interested in this is that there is a discussion about whether Damascus was conquered in the first year, before Yarmouk, or after Yarmouk. And the problem is that the only dated document is after Yarmouk. But he says this is the explanation for it, that the first document was undated and was sent to Medina, and then the second document was dated, and that's why some historians say the second date is the correct one. Now, this is at one level, it's a very trivial, sort of almost pedantic bit and piece. At another level, it shows a real concern for historical accuracy. There is this contradiction. How has this contradiction come about? This is the explanation of how this contradiction has come about. And I think that's very encouraging and interesting, because it feeds in to the great debate about the reliability of early Islamic sources, and the debate that was started off by Kukenkrans, Hagarism, and still lingers on in one place, or in some academic circle and not so academic circle. It seems to me that, well, it seems to me it's a methodological thing, that if you're studying any author, any historian, you should start off from the point of view that he, which is always he, that he is A, intelligent, and B, honest. Now, if you read a lot of this stuff, you may come to the conclusion that your author is stupid or mendacious and dishonest. But the starting point of the discussion should be that your author is intelligent and honest. And if you start to think maybe he's not either of these things, then you should start to think, am I really listening to what he's saying? Or am I trying to impose my own questions on something that he really wasn't interested in at all, or wasn't talking about, or talking about in a different way? But I think that al-Balādhurī is all, even though some of the information is clearly it's far from what we consider the truth, he's fundamentally interested in what is sabah, and what is the honest and what is the clear and obvious working out of events and policy. So I come to the end of my talking about al-Balādhurī's Futuḥ, about myself indeed. But I think that the book is extremely interesting. It's often dismissed and glossed over. People use it typically for cherry picking names and dates and so on. But the book as a whole is extremely lively, interesting, problematic in all sorts of ways. And there has been an argument, and it's something that Ryan Lynch talks about, that this is really an administrative manual. You know, if you want to look up how this thing goes. And to be sure, there's a lot of administrative stuff about the taxation of greens and vegetables in the city of Taif and so on. You can get very interested in that sort of thing. But fundamentally, it's not an administrator's book. It's not a Khatib's book. It's a Nadim's book. It's supposed to be lively, interesting, produce those little nuggets of ancient poetry and bizarre facts which would amuse the caliph. It's a Nadim's book, not a Khatib's book. And when we're reading it, we should always be aware of that. I've said enough. I've said probably got too much for most of it, but I've tried to give you some idea what I've come with this many years of friendship with Ahmad ibn Yaḥya, to give some idea about why I'm interested in this book and what I've tried to do in the translation. Shall we leave it there?
Well, thank you very much, Hugh, indeed. Yes, I would like to thank you for showing that it is still a valid methodology to go through in detail about a text and think about one text and one author. It reminds me, and I don't think it's accidental, of Letitia's talk on Abu Bakr as-Suli and her work on him. That this is somehow things how are most interesting when we are talking about real people, at least for me, and this is the way I try to teach history. But this is how they saw it. Well, most of them saw it, and also that it is still a way to deal with it. So thank you for this. I also want to thank you for showing us kind of tour de force of storytelling with a question at the beginning and one interesting bit after the other with the suspense on. And I have plenty of questions, but I will let others to ask theirs. But I think we all have this question somehow still around that. What do you think his goal was in writing his history? Because I understand that for us, one of the main messages of his work is this question of Thabat. But so what was his motivation? Did you arrive to an answer to that already, or still trying to decipher his?
He's got a job to do. He needs to make money. I mean, that may sound a bit cynical, but it's not really. Lots of people write very good things to make money. Well, what I'm suggesting that he is at the court. He is paid to make to be a reservoir of information, but also to make his accounts of the past to be lively and interesting, entertaining, something that the caliph's going to, in the caliph's own majlis. We've seen him in the caliph's own majlis, that the caliph's going to enjoy. And I think at one level, at least, that is an explanation that is a reasonable explanation in itself. But of course, he does have certain values, and I think particularly the value of accuracy, the delight in obscure and rare poetry, and the careers of virtually unknown people. And one thing also delight in all sorts of things like the etymologies of place names, which are almost always completely absurd. But I mean, that's another area of expertise that he claims to be doing, and so on. So I think we should above all get away from the idea that this is somehow a propaganda work about the great successes of the Muslims, or propaganda work about the Abbasid caliphs or anything like that. I think the word propaganda in understanding Islamic history is, Arabic historical texts, the use of the word propaganda is seldom helpful. And it's often applied very crudely. Of course, it's all Abbasid propaganda or something like that. I think you have to get much. If you're going to make those sorts of claims, you have to look at all sorts of things like who was expected to read it. If it was propaganda, how does it function as propaganda? Anyway, so that's an answer to your question.
Thank you. It tells a lot, because this entertainment, curiosity, and then also the competition which is at court, they are really things which are characteristic of many authors. And yeah, thank you, Hugh. Now, before please, I guess you have already many questions, and I will ask you to raise them, raise your physical or virtual hands, and then I let you go. But before I conclude the recording, I'd like to put here, and hopefully it goes through, the invitation to next week, which is Nedad Arabian's, I think, fascinating topic on magic and religion and religious and religious authorities of accusing each others. So please come also next week. I hope very shortly I will send out the list for all our talks this academic year. So yes, I'll stop the recording now, and we'll ask for your questions.